Welcome everyone tonight. I'm so glad everybody's here. I'm really excited about this event tonight. I'm so excited about our guest, David Zahl. This is what we're calling the Arts and Culture series here at the Cathedral Church of the Advent. And the intent of this series is just to sort of explore common ground between the culture at large and the church, doing that primarily through talking about art, broadly speaking. And tonight that has to do with rock and roll, or music more generally. If we haven't met yet, my name's Matt Schneider. I'm one of the Canons at the Advent. And to my right here is Gil Kracke, who's also on staff. He's our Director of Adult Education. He's also a licensed counselor. And our guest is David Zahl, who's the author of this book. If you want to clap, that's fine. A Mess of Help from the Crucified Soul of Rock and Roll. And he's also the director of Mockingbird Ministries. And the Advent has a strong relationship with that ministry. And I'll just say that actually Mockingbird really is an influence for this series that we are doing. I mean, Mockingbird is a sort of early adopter of connecting cultural topics with the Christian faith. So thank you, David, for influencing what we're doing here tonight. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping things. If you do have a cell phone on you, can you please silence it or vibrate? We are recording the event, so if your cell phone goes off, you'll be that person, which is okay, but we want to keep that to a minimum. If you do need a restroom, it's a little bit of a hike. You've got to go down that hall and through the kitchen doors upstairs. And there's a contact form that's going around. If you'd like to learn more about these kinds of events, please provide your contact information. Whether you're a member of the Advent or not, please put your information down so we'll know to reach out to you about these types of events. And just so you know, we'll have a conversation between the three of us until, until about 8 p.m. or so, and then we'll open it up to some audience Q&A. So if you got some burning questions, keep them in mind for when we come to that. But why don't we get started? And David, who is David Zahl? And by the way, so many people have asked me, does he go by David or Dave? And I've always just called you Dave, and I've never asked you if that's
DZ.
D or DZ, right?
Very cryptic. Very cool.
There's no correct answer to that question, actually.
Okay.
So my mom calls me David, and therefore I think Birmingham knows me as David. But high school, I've always been called Zahl, actually. Very rolls off the tongue. I guess it's a good sort of one-syllable last name. But Dave is what my wife calls me. So I think that's probably the one to go with. Right? That's the right answer.
I mean, you just mentioned this too. By the way, the two of you, can you all hear them? Are their mics on? Maybe bring it up a little bit higher. You have a relationship with Birmingham and the Advent. You want to just mention that, say a little bit?
Sure. As some of you know, my father served as the dean of the Advent for 10 years. I was in high school away at boarding school for part of it, and then at college for other parts of it. But I got to be here during the summers and got to know people, and really come to appreciate Birmingham as kind of a home away from home. And what's funny is reading through the book again on my way down here, I realized how much of the autobiographical sections actually occurred at record stores in Birmingham. So, there are no record stores in Birmingham left, I don't think. At least not the ones I used to go to.
They're all in 5 points.
Charlemagne Records is still there? Yeah. I knew they would be the last one standing. But, oh, fantastic. What do I know? But I would say a lot of my formative experiences were like babysitting and lifeguarding, using that money to go buy records. So that was like, and then it all kind of came out in the wash, I guess, with this.
And so we're going to talk about the book mostly tonight. What makes this book unique? What makes it different than other music books? And can you say like just a tad about that cover art?
Sure. So I knew I wanted to write at length here. Having written on a website for a long time, I knew I wanted to put out something full length. And when I was looking back at everything I posted for Mockingbird and various other publications over the years, The stuff that I felt most connected to, or that had gotten the best writing out of me, the best prose, and clearly where the heart was almost always articles about music. And so I took all these essays that I'd written for Mockingbird, basically, and then I rewrote them, and I completely changed them and tried to weave some threads through. But what I realized is what I ended up sort of writing as much a memoir as a taste biography, as you could put it that way, a spiritual. My religious faith is weaved throughout in a way that I felt natural to me, but I wanted to write the book that I'd been wanting to read for a long time. And so I hadn't found many books that, most books about rock and roll completely ignore what the person is actually trying to say, the musician. They usually talk about albums and, personal life stuff. But in terms of what are they actually trying to convey, what is their message, I didn't get much of that from most of those books, but mainly I wanted to write about these particular characters because they resonated with me personally. And I found, as I'll read in a second, that the language of my inner life was the language of pop culture and the language of rock and roll specifically. So in order to write about myself, in order to write about the things that mattered to me, I had to use this language. If I didn't use it, I would be making something up. So that's a little way.
Yeah, that's helpful. And you mentioned this, so why don't we just go ahead and transition into, you have a reading to open us up with, and do you want to say anything about it before, or just launch into reading it?
Well, this is, I wrote the introduction last to sort of see what came up from writing this book. What did I feel the main themes were? And this is sort of how I put some of those main sort of through lines, which you don't have to be interested in rock and roll or pop music or pop culture at all to, I think, identify with. When Christianity took root in my life, I not only found its core message of grace so exciting and enlivening as to be compelled to write about it, but music would become one of the primary lenses through which I came to do so. Not just music, but culture itself, high, low, and in between. In other words, it wasn't that I set out to write about the intersection of Christianity and culture. It was simply the most honest language available to me, the lingua franca of my inner life. And those of you who know my father know that I come by this honestly. This is what, I just grew up with this stuff, so I didn't have a choice. It was my immediate vocabulary for understanding what was happening to me. In fact, so immersed in it was I that to avoid pop culture would have been to embrace precisely the kind of phoniness that permeates so much religious, quote, engagement with it these days. David Foster Wallace, another tragic and easily romanticized hero of mine, articulated the situation this way. In terms of the world I live in and try to write about, popular culture is inescapable. Avoiding any reference to the pop world would mean either being retrograde about what's permissible in serious art, or else writing about some other world. This book, to me, represents 7 years' worth of straining through that lens to see the world. And I talk about one of the chief operating assumptions in this book is that there's only one reality, which is another way of saying that there's no difference between what is real for the religious person and the non-religious one. Reality is singular and it applies across the board. We may interpret things differently from others, but those interpretations have little bearing on the truth itself. To the extent to which a song or a movie or a joke is rooted in something real will be the extent to which some connection can be made to truth, even the truth. What then is this truth we see played out and corroborated in the lives and work of pop eccentrics? It's myriad, but 3 dominant aspects are worth mentioning. First and most importantly, there's the truth of human nature, what the book of Job describes as man born to trouble just as sparks fly upward. We are our own worst enemies, and suffering, both self-inflicted and otherwise, is the tie that binds our species. Original sin is simply human self-centeredness replicated and evenly distributed. And work which ignores this reality and puffs up human agency will fall flat eventually. No school of thought has a more sober understanding of human limitation, or a more hopeful answer than the Christian one. If our shared humanity serves as the initial point of connection with pop eccentrics, 2 further realities we might recognize are those of, you guessed it, law and It's educated.
You're in the right place.
Yeah. What do I mean by law? Law refers to a basis of righteousness, whether it be civil or moral, any authoritative measure or standard from which judgments can be extrapolated. It could be the capital L law of the Ten Commandments, or the Sermon on the Mount, or the oughts and ought nots we find there. It could equally be the condemning echoes we hear from Madison Avenue. Thou shalt be beautiful, or successful, or intelligent. Or simply the internalized voice of a demanding parent, that feeling of never being quite enough, which drives so much of our striving and exhaustion. The law's exact form may be fluid, but its accusatory voice never wavers. It instigates the self-justification that occupies so many of our waking hours, as well as the resulting isolation and competition. All may have fallen short of the glory of God, but that hasn't stopped us from comparing distances.
That's a good
just a little bit more. Oftentimes the secular world, the quote-unquote secular world, is viewed as an escape from the oppressive moral strictures of religion, which it sometimes can be, for a stretch. And yet, as a number of the essays contained herein hopefully testify, the secular world can be just as condemning and judgmental, if not more so, than the religious one. The law of cool, for instance, often turns out to be a crueler taskmaster than the law of God. The latter, at least, has the benefit of not being a moving target. As much as we might wish it were not the case, we do not escape guilt or self-righteousness by leaving church. Law is not an exclusively religious reality, but a human one, as is the response to it. Faced with our nagging failure to do or be enough, we rebel and rationalize, hiding our true selves and wondering whether and where assistance is to be found. The Beach Boys perceptively saying, "You need a mess of help to stand alone." Which quickly brings us to the third point of connection, grace. As we see borne out in our own lives and those of other people, when it comes to lifting the human spirit, nothing is more potent than love in the midst of deserved judgment. If the law at best exposes our shortcomings and at worst breeds total despair, then grace proves, time and again, to be a force that inspires service and creativity and hope and vulnerability and new life. Like law, grace is a reality so powerful that it transcends the ever-shifting zeitgeist and our fickle political sensibilities. It is no coincidence that grace lies at the very heart of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Indeed, grace lies at the very heart of the universe, the love that moves the sun and stars, Dante. There are naturally some risks involved in a project like this. Lord knows I do not wish to assign spiritual intent or import where there is none, or reduce the power and fun of pop music by denying its ineffability. Nor do I mean to trivialize the claims of Christianity or venerate a culture that exacerbates self-aggrandizing and hurtful nonsense just as often as not. Fortunately, the song has not yet been written which can inflict wounds that aren't there already, or demolish the hope that was secured on Easter morning. We are free, in other words, to love, both our culture and those who are making and consuming it, which is everyone. We might therefore approach it not with defensiveness and fear, but with curiosity and humor. To laugh and to cry, to play, to be wowed and moved, to be surprised and to empathize. Again, my hope is that tracing the unintentional but inescapable confidence with which some of this music points to both the tragedy of human life and its possible redemption can only deepen our faith. It certainly has mine. And even if it doesn't, well, I trust that our merciful friend will live up to his name.
Wow.
All right.
That's the intro.
I thought your intro I thought it was a gold mine, your intro. I really did. One part that I particularly liked, I don't think you even read it. You talked about mediation. That somehow for you, music is a much less mediated medium. I think you were comparing it to, say, TV shows, even great shows or movies. Say more about that. You know, what is it about music? What is mediation?
Well, I realized that I think what the part you're referring to has to do with why was it for me that music meant more than movies? Because a lot of us, we spend a lot of money on movies, you know. We spend even more money on video games, it turns out, which are highly mediated experiences. But it has everything to do with identification. For me, I identified with these artists that I loved. There was no beginning or end to their story. They rose and sank, and my star fell and rose along with it. Films have a beginning and an ending. You just don't have the same kind of identification with Bill Murray as you do to Brian Wilson, who is a real person who's theoretically speaking from the heart. But I think another form of mediation that I talk about is that music allows you to feel feelings and explore corners of your heart in life that you're too scary to go into without a mediator, without a guide, without someone saying, here's this extreme aggression that you're afraid to feel because you don't know what that would say about you. You don't know if you can handle it. You don't know if the world can handle it. Listen to this song. Let Kurt Cobain feel it for you. And try it on.
A substitute or something.
A substitute, yeah. And I think that there's a real permission to, I think I was reading this today, and it's one of these situations where you're like, did I write that? But what we mean when we talk about the therapeutic value of music, not that it makes us feel better, but that it gives us permission to feel worse, to come as we are, doused in mud and soaked in bleach.
I wonder, with all that you're talking about, if we could just sort of go as a deep example of one particular character in your book of all that you're talking about. And of course, Brian Wilson is huge in the book because of the title, but I know closest to your heart is also Michael Jackson. And so I wonder if you could talk about those two, or one or the other, and maybe even just the comparison or how they're similar, and all that you just explained about music and why it connects with you more than, say, movies.
Well, this is what someone wrote in 2014, and I quoted it here, but I think it's the reason why Michael Jackson, I can talk about Michael Jackson because everyone here has an opinion about Michael Jackson. You can't have grown up in America in the last 60 years and not have had some connection with Michael Jackson. And that may be any number of opinions here. But this is interesting about him. This was written by someone for, I think the website Slate. Empathy is the quality that's missing from virtually everything ever written about Michael Jackson. We glorify him, or we vilify him, or we pity him, or we take his changing appearance and we use it as fodder for theories about race and gender, the highbrow equivalent of objectification you'll find in the tabloids. We do all of this, but we do not attempt to understand him. The notion of Michael Jackson as a human being remains a radical notion. Make no mistake, Michael was not lying when he famously told us he was, quote, not like other guys. That's the Thriller video. But that does not mean his life and music can't tell us something about the man in the mirror. I have an addiction to cute puns.
This book is great on Twitter.
Yeah, the editor who worked with me on this, he basically had to dial back the self-referential cutesiness by 20%.
So this is a mediated piece.
It's a mediated piece. But Michael Jackson is the extreme, I think grace, the whole thing is actually written from the point of view of grace. And grace is what says that God loves us apart from our actions, our doing, our striving. That he loves us because he loves us through the lens of Christ. And that, I think, gives a person the assurance to really deal with who they actually are. And are there parts of me that identify with Michael Jackson? I mean, that's a dangerous question for people because he's weird.
I mean, you say in the book we're all Michael Jackson.
You're going to take away my finale. No,
I'll just stop talking. Gil, take it over.
No. You're Michael Jackson. The book is as much about identification as anything else, and I think that when we're young and we're trying to figure out who we are, we often look to people that we admire to tell us who we are. I mean, that's apparent, but it's usually some form of literature or a relationship that we're in. With a lot of young men especially, it seems to be bands. It's just young women too. But you go to a lot of these shows and there's nothing but dudes. It's I don't know what's going on, but they're lacking role models, perhaps you might say. And so I was looking to all these guys to tell me who I was. And Michael Jackson was sort of like, well, can I find something of myself in that? And I think I did. Can we have sympathy for someone who is that strange?
Yeah. So in a footnote. The thing I remember in Michael Jackson's chapter was the footnote that you did where, let's see if I can remember it, Cry Me a River, poor Michael Jackson sitting on a mountain of money and all that stuff. But you talked about condition of being a human being, alienation, loneliness, despair, the pastoral side of me, completely connected with that. That, look at what he's doing. He's driven.
Yeah.
So unfree, so sad.
This is what Roland Bainton wrote about Martin Luther, his great, Roland Bainton wrote the book Here I Stand. Those who are predisposed to fall into despondency, as well as to rise into ecstasy, may be able to view reality from an angle different from that of ordinary folk. Yet it is a true angle, and when the problem or the religious object has been once so viewed, others less sensitive will be able to look from a new vantage point and testify that the insight is valid. What he's saying is that Martin Luther was a total extreme case. Mm-hmm. He was an extreme neurotic, is how we would really describe him, What does Erickson say? He was a great patient of great importance for Europe. But people who take things to the extreme, often we can find something of the truth. And it turns out I was attracted to nothing but kind of extreme cases. And yet, what you find if you really look deep enough into all of these, Elvis Presley, for example, and Axl Rose and Brian Wilson, they're lonely. Clearly money doesn't solve people's problems. Mm-hmm. And you know what? Talent doesn't either. In fact, it makes it worse in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. These deep sensitivities people have mean that they're able to feel the highest highs but the lowest lows. And so, does the gospel apply to them? If it applies to Michael Jackson, then maybe it applies to me.
One chapter in there that I do really enjoy is the one on Elvis, and that period of his life where he was a little more obscure, or people, that era of his life, was it the 60s or
the late 60s?
Late 60s, and he did a bunch of movies. And one of them in particular is this one, Change of Habit. Man, I texted you right afterwards, like, wow, I need to go see this movie. Can you describe?
It's not playing in theater.
Yeah. You can find it on YouTube.
Yeah, all of Elvis's movies, they're so highly regarded that they're all available for free on Netflix. on YouTube, not even Netflix. Change of Habit is the final of Elvis's feature films, and he was making 4 a year by the end. And he was locked into these contracts. You may not know that Elvis Presley was the first movie star to make $1 million a picture. Anyway, so it didn't matter what he was in. He was going to make his $1 million and go home. And that quickly became like, okay, well then let's make the worst possible, quickest buck we could. The final movie he was in, called Change of Habit, Mary Tyler Moore is in it. It's about a doctor, played by Elvis, named John Carpenter. Get it? JC. So he's in the inner city, and it's extremely politically incorrect. But Mary Tyler Moore is one of these, is a nun. It's a Catholic nun, a plainclothes nun. It's in the middle of the ecumenical movement that was going on in the late 60s. It's the only time.
Like a Vatican II movie.
Yeah, it's the only time I have ever heard the ecumenical movement referred to by name in a Hollywood motion picture.
You're still watching the movie?
Yeah. Anyway, so Elvis, of course, falls in love with Mary Tyler Moore, and no one is, everyone is, who is immune to Elvis Presley's charms. But the reason I got into it is because someone sent me a clip of Elvis leading worship at a Catholic folk mass in the late 60s. There's like a crucifix behind him. There's everyone's, altar boys and the whole nine. But he's there with sideburns playing a song called Let Us Pray. And it's a great song. And the bass is really funky. And he's like, what is this? And it turns out it's this movie, Change of Habit. And there's a lot to be said for this film, which you can all watch. It's like it's very jarring. It goes from really heavy scene to really inappropriate humor to great music, everything in between. I think they filmed it in like a week.
So, were there any particular individuals in the book? I feel like anybody that I talk to about this book, they say that particular, Elvis or Axl Rose. For me, it was Belle and Sebastian. I'm sure that probably wasn't it for you, but was
Probably
it?
not.
Who was it? You didn't know who Belle and Sebastian was.
Axl Rose. Loved your relationship with him. And then Brian Wilson. Say more about Brian Wilson, where the whole sort of mess of help thing came from. A lot of us knew him only through Bare Naked Ladies. We're like,
Right.
What? What happened? Did it really happen? So,
Blind had been just like Brian Wilson.
So Brian Wilson is the songwriter and main, visionary behind the Beach Boys, which they're the most highest-selling American rock group of all time. So it's not like a small dip in the water. of like our culture. This is a major force. And Brian Wilson, the first thing that attracted to me is he was one of the first very sensitive. They call him the straight man's Judy Garland. He's very sensitive guy. He was writing these songs about being tough, and Elvis, and everyone's wearing leather jackets, and then along comes Brian Wilson, and he's singing about like being in his room, and he's constantly talking about being crying. A lot of male tears in Brian Wilson's song, male adolescent tears, and then. So I felt for this guy, and it's very hard. The empathy is off the charts. But the other thing is that he's completely untrained. He's an autodidact of the highest order. He basically, at the age of 17, just sat down at a piano one day and figured out harmonies for these 4 freshman songs, and he just went from there. And so I see grace at work because. He's not a person who his inner sophistication, if you ever heard him try to explain his talent or his gift, it's borderline moronic. But he can't do it without citing God, by the way. But when someone's gift is so out of proportion with who they are, we know people like this. So, and it may not be in a smaller way, but his gift, his talent, he did not earn it. He didn't do anything to deserve it. It just came to him. And I think that's how God works. And I think so I see this cracked vessel and all this light shining through it. And I can't help but wonder where the light's coming from. And so he would, even when he wasn't trying to do something good, would do something amazing.
Can you talk about creativity then? And one thing that sticks with me in this book is where you talk about often we look to the youth for creativity, but then you talk a bit about creativity coming even in an older age and sometimes really good things. Say more about this idea.
If you start thinking seriously about rock and roll or pop culture in general, you come up against all these cultural edicts that are there that maybe you didn't think, that you've kind of taken on faith. But one of them is that creativity is the realm of the young. It's sort of for people that are under the age of 40.
Right.
And that's nonsense. I mean, that's clearly not true. It's not true if you read Cormac McCarthy. It's not true if you listen to Bill Fay. It's not true if there are any number of great. Marilyn Robinson won the prize again this year. She's getting up there.
She's more than 40.
She's more than 40. So I was very interested in that, and that was one of the many, the ageism that is, that's kind of a buzzword now, but it's really true when it comes to pop music. And so if you can find someone like Brian Wilson's like 75, he looks like somebody's grandfather, and he just put out a new record, and it's amazing.
Really?
But the people who are writing and consuming pop music are so skewed towards not just young people, but people who've got a young perspective on life, who haven't thought much about death, in other words. So it tends to be not as, the bias is always head in that direction. Not that there's anything wrong with it per se, but if you don't have the rest of it, there's a reason why Bob Dylan's so important and remains, because the only interview Bob Dylan gave on his new record was to the AARP. That's pretty cool. It's a great interview.
U2 gives Brian Wilson a big nod on their new record. Did you know that? California.
Yes.
Just want to let you know that.
Everyone does. You can't.
So what about going back to the creativity part, the crucified soul of rock and roll? Why crucified? Why not resurrected or incarnated or ascended? Play the theology out. What is it about crucifixion that so fits rock and roll?
Well, there's another myth out there that creativity is yoked to suffering. And when Paul McCartney's wife died, Linda, I was, the cynical part of me was very excited because I thought, here comes a great record. Terrible, the man's lost his soulmate, and I'm thinking this could be really good for us. And so that, I don't want to say that's necessarily true, but what I noticed with a lot of these artists that I'm interested in is their trouble is almost always proportioned to their gifts. Like, you don't get through life without suffering, and a lot of times the weakness is the point at which they find their gift. to the point where you're on your knees. You know, a lot of the stories that I try to tell in here are of people coming to the end of themselves and finding inspiration at the point where they have essentially been crushed or made low or brought to their knees. And so I find that to be very in keeping with Corinthians and with the Christian dynamic of death and resurrection. So the crucified soul of rock and roll, and rock and roll generally is about discontent. It's very hard to write. Bono's the one who always says it's extremely hard to write joyful rock music.
Yeah.
It's like much harder than writing something about.
Do you think rock and roll's gone? I mean, lead singer, lead guitarist, bassist, drummer.
Yeah, what is rock and roll anymore, right?
Yeah.
Well, I said, guys, I'm not going to touch that question. I have no
it's
idea.
outside of the book.
It's I think that some of this stuff will never die, but the parameters may change, and I'm not a Luddite. Like this, there's great music coming out every day. I like the democratization of the music industry. The democratization of the publishing industry is what allows Mockingbird to put out all of our books. So I think it's great, but I also think that everything the Ecclesiastes is right. There's like a time and a season to everything. History of pop music is of certain styles coming back and going out of, it's nothing changes and everything changes.
Well, speaking of Ecclesiastes, the final chapter is called Confessions of a Former Music Critic. In that you talk about identity and sort of, as our collect says, that I open with sundry and manifold changes of the world, and how things do sort of go through cycles, and there are these sort of laws that are related to music, and ones that you brought up are sort of the laws of obscurity, a law of irony, law of cynicism, and unpack that chapter for us in terms of for you and what that meant for you as a music critic. Where's the grace?
Well, I'll tell the story of what the way it started. Well, this realization came to me. There used to be a great record store in Homewood called Noise, and it was next to the Homewood Sporting Goods, and it was the best record store I've ever been to. And I've been to ones all over the country, and this was so well curated, is the word for it now. I was introduced to more great music there than anywhere I've ever been. But I also had an experience there that showed me how vapid and how much layer of identity politics is layered on top of the music itself. How much law, in other words, how much dictates, how much social forces. When I went in there, and this is the guy who introduced me to things like the Left Bank and Scott Walker and these very cool bands that no one knows about. And he said, you gotta listen to this. It's the best single I've heard in 10 years. And he turns on a CD, and it's Coldplay's Yellow, okay? Which is an amazing song. But I was like, that's a great song, I'll get that record the day it comes out. The band became enormous. They're a big band. They made millions and millions of dollars. He married Gwyneth Paltrow. Then they consciously uncoupled. But I went back in there after the next break from school, and I said, well, I really liked that Coldplay record. And he said, they're terrible. I said, what? I thought they were cool. I thought they were good. It was a moving target. And in that moment, it's like, this is all a waste. I mean, there a lot of this. It's not a waste. This is beautiful music that we're talking about. But there's so much nonsense about what you should like and what you shouldn't like, layered on top of any objective merits that the music may or may not have. And so I use Bob Seger as an example there. I use Celine Dion as an example. There's this great story about a guy who has a Pandora subscription. Pandora is a free music streaming service. It's like a radio that's curated for just you. And he writes into the service, he says, Celine Dion keeps coming on my station. Something is wrong with this. It's like, well, what's the station? Oh, it's around Sarah McLachlan, who's a singer-songwriter. And it's like, well, did the music, was it jarring to the rest of the? Well, no. Was it was it unlike anything else? He's like, well, not really, but it was Celine Dion. And he'd have all these back and forths with the guy, and then finally he realizes, oh my goodness, I like Celine Dion.
The law undressed you.
Yeah. And there's a point in time, we're still living in the age where to like confess that you like Celine Dion or you enjoy her, even ironically, is to take.
Can you enjoy
It's to
Celine
basically come out as a non-serious person in life.
Can you couple that to Axl Rose? I love that chapter too. Because you had the law of cool, and you also named the law of relevance, which I thought was really great. As if Axl Rose was concerned with the law of relevance, or being relevant.
Yeah, that's another term critics always throw out, and critics of anything.
Yeah.
Critics of
Relevant church
politicians
is a
talk
big
about
deal. Yeah.
relevant church. No artist that's worth much is ever interested in being relevant.
Yeah.
They're interested in conveying something authentic to themselves, or they're doing something beautiful, doing something that will last. Relevant is mishmash. It's like the human condition remains static. So the relevant things are just eternal things, I think. So, but Axl Rose was. The Axl Rose chapter is I love it because he's
It's a good chapter.
He grew up in a fundamentalist background with going to church 4 times a week in rural Indiana. And he learned how to sing at church, but he had a Pentecostal adopted father, and was very strict with him, and he ran away from it. It was sort of a bootstrapping kind of pietism that Americans seem to specialize in, and he ran as far away as he could from it. And what he found in LA was some freedom and some acceptance and some love. And the fruit of that was this incredible collaboration called Appetite for Destruction, the best-selling debut record of all time. And you can't go to a sports game, you can't go to an Alabama game without hearing the opening chorus of Welcome to the Jungle. If you don't know what that is, that's what that is. That thing. You can't go to any sporting event in the country without hearing both Paradise City and... So anyway, but that's the fruit of this collaboration of freedom. And of course, once it did as well as it did, it set a standard of like what they had to achieve in order to be seen as continually successful. This is what Michael Jackson dealt with Thriller. The rest of it's like what Michael Spitz dealt with after he won all those gold medals, and what what anyone who has too much success early in life, that success becomes an albatross, and it becomes a law. It becomes, I'm only good if I'm equal to or surpassing this thing that has actually equaled and surpassed everything else that's ever come before it. So with Guns N' Roses, this created a huge amount of acrimony and litigation and ill will, and then ultimately enormous amounts of creative paralysis where the guy didn't make a record for 14 years because he was so focused on it having to be as good as this thing that he felt he had to be. And so there's no freedom in that. So I talk about Axl Rose as relates to the fact that he's got one of the world's largest crucifix collections, and he's, the cover of Appetite for Destruction is a cross, and he can't seem to get away from the crucifixion imagery, even though he wants to. But I think that actually, can I read that end of that
Parker's
chapter?
back almost with the...
Yeah, the only hope I see is the one hanging around Axel's neck and tattooed on his arm. Seriously, despite his severe misgivings about the faith in which he was raised, crosses dominate not only the Use Your Illusion era videos, but his image since then as well. These days, he seldom appears on stage without an enormous cross necklace, an accessory which could be dismissed as a fashion statement, were it not accompanied by his outspoken affection for and collection of antique crucifixes. One can only presume that something about the central symbol of Christianity must have stuck with him. It surely isn't just that he fancies himself a bit of a rock messiah, though clearly he does. Having traveled from the Nazareth of Lafayette to the Jerusalem of the Hollywood Hills, only to be met with resistance and suffering, you can understand how he might identify with our Lord. That's supposed to be slightly tongue-in-cheek. I suspect it goes deeper. Fortune and shame may have eaten Axel alive. Judgment and criticism may have dogged him inside and out. But apparently Calvary never lost its attraction. Not even the most toxic of religious upbringings, decadent of worldly indulgences, or protracted of psychological quagmires could strip it of its power. Perhaps this is because the cross of Christ addresses none more directly than those who have been ravaged by the law and ravaged in return. It summarizes judgment at its most visceral and inescapable. Indeed, the cycle of recrimination kills God himself. Yet in speaking of death and, quote, destruction, and the worst of human nature, also points beyond those things to the one who came not to condemn the world but to save it, to bring an end of the law, and justify those who cannot justify themselves, no matter how many great songs they write or rants they go on. In other words, that glittery crucifix of Axel symbolizes the hope that, like November rain, the fearful cycle of condemnation and reactivity will not last forever. The hope that, yes, there's a heaven above you, baby.
I think that's a good sort of note to end on before going into audience Q&A. But before we do that, one last question: is there anything next? I mean, or is this the albatross?
No, I mean, I wrote a book that no one's interested in, so I'm like, I'm just kidding. You guys are hopefully all interested in someone. But it's a hard sell for Christian people, and it's a hard sell for secular people, you know.
Good point.
So I think that's the book I wanted to write. But I'm not going to write another book like this. I just wrote a book called Law and Gospel, A Theology for Sinners and Saints. And I wrote it with my two colleagues at Mockingbird, and we had a lot of fun with that. And so the next book, I want to write a book about busyness and scorekeeping. So I feel like I got it out of my system. People always ask, well, who would you do in the next book?
Right.
And I think, well...
you're moving on to busyness.
You know, I have some ideas for the next one, but not quite yet.
Great.
Can I read part of that?
Yeah,
the Michael Jackson
I'm sorry.
thing?
Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah.
Is that all right?
We've got to have you read some from Michael Jackson.
Okay. I don't remember where I was when the Berlin Wall fell. I can't tell you what I was doing when I heard that my grandfather had passed. I'm a little shaky on the details of my wife telling me she was pregnant with our second child. But I can recall with crystal clarity the day Michael Jackson died. It was mid-afternoon on June 25th, 2009. I was sitting in Manhattan Church basement working in a windowless office. I got a G-chat message from a friend asking me what I made of the news about MJ. She knew I was a Jackson obsessive. What news? I replied. 5 minutes later, I was legging it to my apartment where I stayed for hours glued to the TV until Jermaine issued that fateful statement. I didn't go to work the next day. We don't get to choose what makes us feel sad or shocks us. We simply respond, and those responses often betray embarrassing sensitivities and values. A close relative had died a few months before Michael, and at her funeral, I had wanted so badly to feel worse. But the emotions simply weren't there. I found that numbness alienating. Not so the day Michael died. This time it was my wife who was alienated. I had refused to take a sick day after that disillusioning case of violent Korean barbecue-related food poisoning a few weeks prior. But this warranted convalescence? Whom had she married? Truth be told, the force of the wallop took me by surprise as well. I'm still trying to figure out what was behind the funk, both Michael's and my own. I read that next part to you, now I'm going to finish with where I end up. Michael's face externalizes an awareness of internal brokenness, the inconvenient reality that all is not as it should be, that creation needs fixing or scrapping altogether. The rebirth, if that is what he was after, didn't work. It couldn't. The wounds and questions were internal, far from the reach of the scalpel. Instead of solving anything, the surgeries only perpetuated themselves, each one leading to the next, with perfection always just out of reach. Not surprisingly, as the changes to his appearance escalated, so did his retreat from the world. Like his erstwhile father-in-law before him, Elvis Presley, he had to marry the daughter of a king. Michael did what suffering people who have the means to reconstruct reality often do. He hid, both in a fog of painkillers and behind the bedazzled walls of Neverland. Lest we exonerate Michael or confirm his self-image as a martyr, let's be clear, his motives were no less mixed than anyone else's. The wounds of childhood are often the place where dysfunction and sin pour most directly out of us, and it doesn't take a degree in psychoanalysis to identify the vicious cycle. Wherever the hurts run deepest is where our weaknesses will inevitably lie. His playing God may have had sympathetic roots, but that doesn't make it any less of an affront to the first commandment. What I'm trying to say is that we are all Michael Jackson. I am Michael Jackson. His problems were simply exposed and amplified. But I am insecure. I am fragile. I vacillate between seeing myself as the victim in every situation and thinking I am somehow the one to blame for all the wrongs. I carry baggage from childhood, conflicting messages received, hurt and regret that I'm still trying to reconcile years later. In more subtle and less expensive ways, I try to reform reality to suit my needs and make me feel better about myself. I certainly have things I would change about myself if I could, no question. I mourn that June afternoon for all the Michael Jackson music we will never get to hear. I mourn for the fans he left behind and the comeback they never got to witness. But more than that, I mourn because Michael's infirmities, which were my own, had not dissolved into a pile of sand like he did at the end of the Remember the Time short film. I mourn that day because his gifts, which were far beyond my own, had not been enough to save him. As much joy as they brought and continue to bring, they wouldn't be able to save me either. Thankful I am also like Michael Jackson in that I am not God. I need God. I like to think that the Apostle Paul was thinking of Michael and me when he wrote 2 Corinthians with its beautiful words about reconciliation, relief, and rebirth. If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has gone, the new has come. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting men's sins against them. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. No matter how hard he tried, no matter how much surgery he got, or how many number one hits he scored, Michael Jackson could not transcend his own weakness any more than he could relive the past. Which means that the hope for Michael Jackson is the same as ours. It lies in the one whose property is always to have mercy, who does not hold our transgressions or talents against us, and instead grants newness of life to all who would usurp his station. Pretenders to the throne are not shunned, but forgiven. Yes, even those wearing sequin gloves. Can I get a shamon?
Let's open it up for some questions. Does anybody have a burning question they'd like to ask? Do you want to ask a question, or do you want to?
Use your mic.
Yeah. Do you want to manage the mic for us?
Sure.
As sort of the resident senior citizen, I want to run this past you. You mentioned Axl Rose had a Pentecostal background. I recall reading in that wonderful journal of Southern Life, Garden and Gun, an article about Jerry Lee Lewis. Jerry Lee Lewis, Elvis Presley, Waylon Jennings, and I believe one other guy had a great jam session in one of the Memphis recording studios. Jerry Lee and Elvis outlasted the other two. The reason Jerry Lee said is because we came from a Pentecostal background. We knew how to sing, we knew how to preach, we knew how to act, and we knew how to play. It seems to me there's a thread that runs through from blues, rhythm and blues, country and western, and proceeds into rock and roll, that all of this has some sort of a common thread starting way back long before even I was born. And do you find that to be true in your research on rock and roll?
Well, it's very difficult to take it, to remove rock and roll from its from the church. I mean, a lot of this comes from rhythm and blues, and some people, Bono is always quoted, says that the Psalms are the blues. You know, that
Songs of Lament.
the songs of lament, and that's where a lot of that language actually comes from. And you know, the spirituals that people sang on the plantations. I mean, that actually forms the backbone of all that. In terms of the culture of Pentecostalism and the revival tents and things like that, I think a certain amount of show business was inherent in that, and that did help people know what worked and what didn't, and have the stamina needed. I mean, some of those revival meetings were like 6-7 hours long. But you know, most of the people I write about here have pretty conflicted relationships with the church. But I think that the closer they, intentionally or not, their voice, when it's articulating something that's universal, is going to get very close to the gospel, or at least to a Christian understanding of life, which is just an understanding of life. So I find it to be extremely encouraging to me in my faith that these great heroes of mine actually, when I listen to their music, when I hear the yearnings of their heart, the frustrations, their desire to love and be loved, to their the heartaches, the difficulties they have with their with global structures and institutions, and their yearning for forgiveness. I mean, I hear the same things I hear on Sunday. I wish that the church was a little bit better of a hospital, or more of an option. But yeah, well, there you go.
Church is an option, isn't that from
Church is an option, Portlandia.
Portlandia? Anyway, another question.
Hi, David. I wanted to ask a music connoisseur such as yourself, if you had one song to pick, what would it be to best describe suffering, and is there law of gospel in the center of it?
Looking at Johnny Cash movie, you got one
That's
song
right.
to sing.
The thing that comes immediately to me is there's a Beach Boys song called "Till I Die." It's like people call it the last gasp of the cogent Brian Wilson before he kind of floated off into the ether of schizophrenia and drug use. But it's I'm a cork on the ocean, floating over the raging sea. How deep is the ocean? I lost my way. These things I need until I die. And this is very lost soul on the waves of life, confused, battered, broken, and it's also a beautiful song. So I think that there's something very beautiful about that. I mean, if you were to, there are other people that probably perform things in a more, there's not much law and gospel to that outside of the fact that life is just, if you confront life with open eyes, it will crush you. And so the law works on people whether they're in church or not. And so to that extent, the very fact that he's writing a song, that he feels the need to sing something and that it comes out so beautifully, is in itself an act of grace to me. So that's how I would hear that. There's tons of songs in here that I think capture the dynamics we're talking about. There's tons that don't, but they're not in here.
Let's wait for the mic.
Hey, I think your dad probably would have said whipping post. He seemed to bring that up quite often. I was just wondering, how have we gone in 50 years or so from burning records to Christian rock, and is that really a thing, and do you like it? I mean, I'm still a little conflicted about it. It's like, that doesn't seem right to me. It should be either rock and roll or church. And
Right. Yeah. I think that's a false dichotomy, frankly. I think that there's nothing about the form itself that is anti-Christian. If it's talking the truth, then the truth is the truth. But there's a lot of idolatry and, as I say, nonsense that goes along with rock and roll. A lot of delusion. But at its best, if it's conveying any truth, either emotional truth or intellectual truth, then it's got something to say. As far as Christian rock is concerned, I mean, I think there's lots of great artists who are Christians who make rock and roll music. I think the genre known as Christian rock or contemporary Christian music is a bastardization of that. And I think it's a commercial. It's what's motivating it is almost never it's a bottom line mentality. It's pretty crass when you get down to it. But I see an enormous amount of incredibly gifted artists who are writing from that perspective. I mean, I was at a Sufjan Stevens concert last night in Richmond, and it was transcendent. It was as good as anything I've ever seen. But then, I've listened to the new Kendrick Lamar record, and that's got a lot going on in it about guilt and forgiveness and, desire for mercy and judgment. And in fact, I see a creeping number of signs of life in this regard. They just tend not to be very commercial. But there's U2. There's always U2.
Do you have any final thoughts to a captive audience?
Final thoughts? Thanks for listening. I think I poured my heart into this book, and it's a bit of a stretch because this is what I was trying to do with this book. What we do with Mockingbird is actually really serious, although we don't take ourselves seriously. My hope is that I'm trying to convey connections between how we live life and things that we believe to be true about deeper things. And you can do that by telling people or by showing them. And telling people usually gets more traffic, and because it gets people upset, it gives them something to disagree with. But showing a person how these things work out in the life of a human being, how judgment crushes you, and how it creates humility, and humility is a place where faith is born. To show how that happens in your own life and in the lives, that's what I'm trying to do with this book. It's ambitious. My fear with this was always the same as my fear with anything that we do with Mockingbird, is that you get labeled as like a pop culture ministry, or that you're overly interested in pop culture. And like, pop culture, I don't care about pop culture really. It's just the honest language it's the world in which I live. So I always find it's diminutizing, and it makes it sound juvenile, like Mockingbird's a glorified youth ministry. And what we're talking about is sin and guilt and redemption and death. Like that's atonement and mercy. And so I don't think those things are juvenile at all. And I wouldn't want to trivialize those things by writing about them through the lens of Axl Rose. But if you listen to the music that Axl Rose made, that's not trivial feelings that are coming across.
Yeah.
Like a 13-year-old may be really upset about something that you would consider petty. But if you remember what it's like to be 13, those are very real feelings. And so no matter what the venue is that people are dealing with reality, we can judge it, or we can try to understand it and find the point of connection. And that's what I ultimately hoped to do with the book. I'm not sure if that's come across, frankly, because it gets really eccentric. You write about eccentrics, you have to be eccentric yourself a little bit. And but it's the best I could do.
That's all you can do.
Yeah.
Well, I think it comes across. And thank you so much for being here tonight. And thanks, Gil, for being our conversation partner. Buy the book. There's also copies of Law and Gospel, which David mentioned. Cindy, raise your hand over there. Cindy's got books, and also a couple copies of... I hear some grumbling over here. Okay, sorry. I thought maybe I missed a burning question or something. But buy the books. And the magazine's for sale too. And just a couple announcements. We are keeping the series up. The next event is on July 9th, Thursday at 7:30 a.m. We're partnering with Birmingham Creative Roundtable. James Kling's there. James, raise your hand. We're doing an event with David Fleming, who's the CEO of Rev Birmingham, and he's going to be talking about Birmingham's past, present, future, drawing on the power of place to inspire creativity. So if you could wake up that early and come downtown to Kleeman Commons at the Advent, please come out to that event on Thursday, July 9th at 7:30 a.m. And if you're not familiar with the Advent, please know that we worship on Sunday. We have worship services at 7:30 a.m., 9 a.m., 11 a.m., and 5 p.m. And I want to thank all the volunteers that helped to put this event on tonight. Thank you, Brandon, for coordinating the event, and thank you to Andrew Farrow. Is he somewhere back there from Cahaba Brewery for providing the beer? Can we give him a round of applause? Amanda Thames from Davenport's Pizza Palace for providing the pizza. Let's give them a round of applause. you all for coming, and most especially thank you so much, Dave. I've been so
Thanks for having
excited
me.
about this. I'm so glad you're here. Please feel free to stick around, drink the rest of the beer, eat the rest of the pizza, buy the books, mingle. Thank you for coming. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thank you.